This is Miriam Tasnif Abbasi with the Department of Toxic Substances Control. I want to thank all the attendees for signing up and joining us this morning. We're going to start off the presentation with Noemi Emmerich-Ford from EPA Region 9. I'm going to be going next, and after that, we're going to be joined by Catherine Dominic of the State Water Resources Control Board. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Noemi so she can get started on her presentation.
Good morning. As Miriam said, I'm Noemi Emmerich-Ford. I'm with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. I'm place-based in our Los Angeles field office, although our main office is located in San Francisco. Our Brownfields program is a national program. So when you're applying for funding through our Brownfields program, you're competing against applicants across the U.S., not just those that are on the West Coast. So I wanted to start with first funding to give you an idea of the Brownfields funding that we've had in the past. And keep in mind, again, that this is national funding. So as you can see from FY stands for fiscal year. So from fiscal year 2014 going up to fiscal year 2018, the amounts have dropped considerably, and that's because of the funding we receive through Congress. But as you can see, anywhere we usually get an average of 400 to 450 or 500 applications last year, and we only end up awarding a small portion of that, as you can see from the slides. So the reason fiscal year 19 is not listed on the slide is we have not, due to the government shutdown, we have not made decisions on 19, but hoping to do that sometime in early June. And so we're going to kind of walk you through the fiscal year 20 funding that we have available, and then also just briefly talk about some grant writing tips. So I'll start with, for those who are familiar with Brownfields, you know that the Brownfields law was reauthorized last year, and it's now called the BUILD Act. And within the BUILD Act, two of the things that I think are most pertinent to applicants who might be applying for funding, maybe you've applied in the past and weren't awarded funding. If it was due to issues of maybe being considered a responsible party by EPA, I would suggest you check back in with us, because the BUILD Act has provided some leniency to some of our rules regarding that. So the first is that we amended the bona fide prospective purchaser definition for a tenancy or leasehold, and also for government entities. An AAI Phase 1 and all appropriate inquiry Phase 1 is no longer needed for properties that were purchased before January of 2002. For all of our funding, this was also a change that came about with the BUILD Act. So eligibility for all of our grant types includes states, tribes, local governments, regional government entities, and nonprofits. So in the past, nonprofits were only eligible for a particular set of our grants. Now they're eligible for all grant types that I'm going to talk about today. And just keep in mind that we define nonprofits as a 501c3. And so also with the BUILD Act, the other thing to consider is that there was new evaluation criteria that was specifically written into the law that provides a focal point on renewable energy projects as well as waterfront development projects. And it also allows, for those who may have asked in the past, it does allow up to 5% of the grant funds to be spent on administrative costs, which was prohibited from FY18 and before. So with our fiscal year 20 funding, for those who are familiar with our funding in the past, we called it, last year it was called MAC. It was just multi-purpose assessment and cleanup. That was all that we offered. But this year, for our fiscal year 20, we're offering MARC. I guess the R would come before the C, but it's multi-purpose assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan fund. All of those are going to be offered in one joint request for proposals that'll come out sometime in the fall. And so that's what the bulk of the presentation will be centered on. So I'll first start with the multi-purpose grant. So this is a newer grant type that was just authorized in the new BUILD Act, and last year was the first year that we had eligible for this grant. And this grant encompasses both assessment and cleanup activity. So you can do assessments, you can do planning, you can do cleanup, you can do redevelopment planning. The grant max for this grant type last year, we only allowed for it to go up to $800,000. The bill in the BUILD Act says that these grants could go up to $1 million. We just weren't given enough money, so we held it at $800,000. I'm pretty sure for FY20 we'll also keep it at $800,000. This grant type's different than our other grant types in that it's a 5-year period of performance. Two of the things that you must have included when applying for the multipurpose grant is you have to have an overall plan for revitalization. So the idea would be that there is an area within your community that you have already spent a bulk of funds on where you're interested in trying to have that entire area revitalized. The other thing is, and you have to have a description for that. The other thing is that since it is assessment and cleanup together, there must be at least one site within your revitalization area that you do own that would be eligible for cleanup funding. If you apply for multipurpose funding, then you are not eligible to apply for an assessment or cleanup grant. So you couldn't get a multipurpose grant and a cleanup grant within the same year. If you apply for this grant type, it knocks you out of applying for either assessment or cleanup. So with the multipurpose grant, given that you can do both assessment and cleanup work, and you can also do planning work, we want at least 70% of the funds to be spent on site-specific work, meaning that you would be doing either the cleanup or you would be doing phase 1 and phase 2s. $200,000 must be spent, a minimum of $200,000 must be spent on cleanup. So if for some reason you could not find a site that you own that would be eligible in order to conduct the cleanup within the 5-year period, EPA would pull back the $200,000. There is a cost share of $40,000. It's a 20% cost share. And last year we did not allow for cost share waivers to be accepted. I'm not sure if that'll also apply in FY20, but most likely it would. The next grant type is the assessment grants. Assessment grants has been the staple of our Brownfields grant program. It's probably the most popular, where we receive the most applications. These are 3-year grants where you can use the funding to either plan to create a Brownfields inventory in your community or to conduct phase 1 and phase 2 assessments. You can use it for community engagement. You can use it for redevelopment planning. There's also, we've received the flexibility where in the past, for those who are familiar with our funding, where you had to apply for either 150 of hazardous substance or 200,000 hazardous substance or 100,000 of petroleum, there's no designation. So if you want all the money for hazardous substance, you can apply for all hazardous substance. If you want it for petroleum, or you can split it however you like. There's no specific designation for the two as we've had before. Within our assessment grants, what I just described is our community-wide assessment grants, and those are $300,000. We also have coalition grants, which you could get up to $800,000. It's usually set around $650,000, but it's where you have 3 partners who come together to be able to conduct these assessment activities, but you only have 1 lead applicant applying with the 2 as partners. The third type of assessment is our site-specific assessment grant. That's a $200,000 grant, but you can get a waiver and get up to $350,000. And with the site-specific grant is that you are able to display that you are not the responsible party for the site that you want to assess. And if for some reason when you apply, if it comes to the time and you get awarded and you no longer need to conduct the assessment at that site, you can't switch the money out for another site. So if you are applying for site-specific, you should be very sure that that is the site indeed that needs characterization, because the money can't be moved to another site. So the other thing, for those who are also familiar with our grant types and have been asked, last year we decided to no longer award area-wide planning grants. However, the activities that could have been conducted under an area-wide planning grant can be conducted under our assessment or multipurpose grant. So you can spend up to 30% in either grant to use it on redevelopment activities. So those activities could include site reuse, could include market evaluations, development of your area-wide plan, site designs, infrastructure, markets under both the assessment and multipurpose grants. I'm going to move us on to our cleanup grant. So kind of inherent in the name, the money is used for remediation. You can only apply for, so in the past, you could apply for 3 $200,000 assessment grants. We've now combined it where you submit 1 application and it's for up to $500,000. And so this was also a change in the BUILD Act where our stakeholders were asking for more than $200,000 to clean up a particular site. So the BUILD Act did authorize up to $1 million for a cleanup grant. Unfortunately, we don't have that much money to be able to do that. So we have cut the limit to the cleanup grants to $500,000. But what's great about this is you're only submitting 1 application, and with the $500,000, you can clean up 1 site, you can clean up 2, you can clean up 5, you can clean up 6. The only thing that you have to ensure is that you own the property and you're not considered a responsible party for the site that you're planning to clean up. Last year, we allowed for cost share waivers only for entities that had a population of less than 50,000. We're not planning to also, or we didn't last year and probably not this year as well, will not accept waivers to try to increase the amount from 500,000 to 650 as we had in the past for our cleanup grant. So that all the information on cleanup grants. The only thing I'll say about the cleanup grants, I think I mentioned there is a 20% cost share and that it's also a 3-year grant term. So lastly is our revolving loan fund grants. So our revolving loan fund grants, these are grants that are only offered every other year. So if you are interested in this grant type, I would suggest that you do apply, even if you don't have your full kind of package together and you're unsure, because this way, even if you apply, we can give you feedback and then you still have a year to get it together before you can apply for the following year. And basically, this is for an entity to be able to set up a revolving loan fund program to provide loans and sub-grants for remediation. So again, who's eligible? This is, as I mentioned, nonprofits are eligible for everything, states and tribes, general purpose units of government. The funding is $1 million. In the past few years, it was about $800,000, and I think it'll range somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, depending on how many people actually apply for the new revolving loan fund. We usually award anywhere from 12 to 14 every year, and it requires a 20% cost share. So cost share does not mean hard cash that you would be returning back to EPA. Cost share can be in time, materials, labor. The individuals who might be managing the grant, your salary might be paid for by your nonprofit, your state, or your local government, but you're overseeing the grant. You can keep track of your time and use that as a cost share. Another component of cost share would be if the remediation, we gave you $500,000, but a remediation at the site might cost $700,000. The extra $200,000 that you're putting in to remediate the site, that could also be used as cost share. For our fiscal year 20, the Brownfields funding, just to kind of recap on a few things I said, is that you can submit an application for both an assessment and cleanup. However, if you apply for a multi-purpose grant, you cannot apply for an assessment and a cleanup grant. That would be your only grant that you could apply for. What we don't have clear yet is if you apply for a multi-purpose, could you apply for a revolving loan fund? So since we have not completed our fiscal year 19 grant awards, we haven't made a decision on that yet. The other thing that to consider is we've also reduced the number of pages for applications. So if you didn't apply last year, typically you couldn't have more than 15 pages for your application. We've now condensed that down to 12. And we've also changed some of the questions in the guidelines. And also no community support letters are needed. So in the past, you would have to get letters of support and attach it to your application. Those are no longer needed. And if you are a current EPA Brownfields assessment grantee, only for assessment grantees, if you want to apply for a new assessment grant, you must have expended at least 70% of those funds before you can apply for additional assessment funding. And so expending 70% by EPA's definition is in our, since the money is in our bank account, if you have not pulled it down from our bank account, and there's more of it there, even though it shows on your books that you spent the money, if it's still in our account, then you wouldn't be able to apply for funding. So kind of for the timeline. So our guidelines will be posted sometime in the fall of 2019. We're hoping that they come out in the September timeframe, but that's sometimes out of our control. So somewhere between September and October. Typically, you have 60 days after the release of the guidelines to apply for the grant. Typically in November through January is when we're doing our threshold eligibility. Notifications of award are in May. You submit your work plan in the summer, and then you'll have access to the funds in July to October. It's usually about a 6-month time frame from the time you apply until you actually receive the funding. So just some things to consider when you're putting your proposal together, kind of before you even start, just who's going to oversee your grant? Is the community vision that you're writing about, is it shared by your partners that you're talking about in your application? Consider how you will engage the community, understanding it's public funds, so we want to ensure that the public is involved, that you have the political support necessary and the infrastructure in place to make the things that you say within your application happen. And if you're planning to assess properties, making sure that you can obtain access to them, and what partners have you contacted for support, and do you have enough of them? So just suggest that I would hope you would do this anyway, but that you read the entire guidelines, because there's often commas, and sometimes within one bullet point, there may be two questions, and we expect you to answer both. So just read the guidelines carefully. Review all of the frequently asked questions. That can also help with putting the application together, and address all the information requested in the criteria. It's not sufficient to simply respond to a criteria. It's the quality of the response that's important. So we often have proposal checklists on our website, so I would say make sure that you use those, and write as though your reviewer knows nothing about your community or state, because oftentimes the individuals who are reviewing your application are from somewhere else across the country, not within California. So just some basic grant writing tips is just, review. Look on our Tab Easy website and look for previous successful applications. If you'd like to see successful applications, you can also contact me directly. Make sure in your application that you're telling a story. Creative writing is super important here. Keep your story detailed and consistent. And if you are applying for funding that would be dealing with a specific site, make sure you contact EPA to ensure that that site is eligible. Because even though you think you might not have caused contamination at the site, EPA's definition is very strict. So make sure you check in with us. The Tab Easy, what I was talking about earlier, it's a website. You can see the website there. It was designed by some of our technical assistance providers, and it basically is the application that you fill in your answers to the questions, and then it'll shoot out the application completed for you in the end in a Word or a PDF file. Some of the grant writing basics, you're participating in this webinar now with DTSC, but EPA will host its own webinar sometime in the fall. So I would suggest participating in that, because we go through the criteria in depth for each of the grant types. And if you are planning to apply, make sure you're ready to submit 1 week before the deadline, because you have to submit it in an electronic system, and there's a lot of checks that you have to ensure that you have. And if you wait till the last minute, you may have done all that work for nothing. The other thing is we have one of our technical assistance providers is the Center for Creative Land Recycling. They can review your application for free and provide you feedback on that. So I would suggest that you take them up on that. And then just consider who is going to be involved in your grant altogether, what the roles and responsibilities are, and who's actually going to be writing it. Will a consultant write it? Who's going to be your editors? Who's going to review it for you? All of those things to think about. And then just kind of an overall view and thinking about telling your story, just consider who you're selling your proposal to. Like you've often heard, what's your elevator speech? So think about what your elevator speech is. How are you going to write that to kind of develop what your project is going to be for the reviewers who are going to be reviewing it. Also consider what's the catalyst for the revitalization and who's going to help. Consider, oftentimes revitalization and the funding that we're giving, projects will serve as a catalyst. So talk about that within your application. And of course, again, because it's public funding, make sure that you have meaningful community engagement, and that you're creative with the outreach methods that you're trying to use that would be most effective for your community. And then just overall, what is the big picture? What is the end use and the reuse, and how will this create change in your community? And then this is just kind of reiterating some of the same things, making sure that you have the right partners involved. And it's always good if you can have a champion, someone who has the vision for your overall program and task that's kind of giving you that overall story to tell within your application. So a key part of this is we consider EPA's Brownfields funding to be seed funding. So we are not looking to fund all of your Brownfields needs within your community. We want it to be seed money. So one of the things that we review heavily is leveraging, being able within your application to be able to calculate what the returns are, thinking about what your sources of local, public, private, or in-kind assistance that you have. So we now ask for, in our cleanup grants, when you say that you have leveraging, you have to provide specific documentation of what the leveraging is. If we're going to clean up the site, we want to know what funding you have in place to conduct the redevelopment. And this is just back to kind of your grant writing basics and the idea that making sure that you describe what your economic decline is, and just make sure that you relate that to brownfield sites. We have so many people say, oh, there was natural disasters. Oh, we had this, but then you don't relate it back to the brownfield site. So if there was a natural disaster and there was a flood, then talk about how you're concerned now because the flood just carried all the contaminants from your brownfield sites and spread it all throughout your community. Make sure that you provide specific examples. So when you're talking about your businesses, make sure that you discuss in detail that, you had a lot of manufacturer closures, you had a lot of retail closures, whatever it is, make sure that you provide specific examples. And then give quantitative information as best as you can. Talk about what the declining tax base is. Not it's just declining, it's declining by 10%. What the job loss is. 10% of jobs have been lost over the past 10 years. What your vacancy rates are for new businesses coming in. And then just overall kind of identify the specific areas where you're going to need your assessment. So if you're applying for a community-wide assessment grant, in your application, your community, even if it's small, still describe areas within your community where you're planning to conduct the assessments. Make sure that you have property owners on board because you have to specifically talk about how you can get access. And then identify any significant redevelopment potential, particularly if your community has put together larger specific plans or redevelopment plans. Make sure those are discussed within your application and what support and funding you have behind those plans. So just lastly on the cleanup grants, I think I mentioned this, but I just want to make sure that you have to own the property before you submit the application and that you are not the responsible party. You also have to have a phase 2 that fully characterizes the site completed by the time of application. You also have to have what we call a completed analysis of Brownfields cleanup alternatives that talks about the different cleanup options that you could do and what those cost estimates might be. We also have an example, if you're not familiar with what we lovingly call an APCA, we have examples on our website of that. And then, as I mentioned, you have to have commitments for leverage funds for cleanup and redevelopment specifically listed as an attachment to your grant application. And you have to have some kind of established redevelopment plan. And then just lastly, use active tone. Make sure you're talking in as if you were writing a news story. Avoid using terms as maybe, intends to, considering. Use your active voice. Do short, direct sentences. It's always best to organize into bullet points. Be direct. Don't have the evaluator guessing. Minimize, and I would actually say do not use any type of vernacular or acronyms because remember, like DTSC, we all know what that is, but people in Boston have no idea. And if possible, use tables. You could do light shading or different fonts to distinguish information that you're using in tables. And use visual variety. For anybody who has to review applications, italics, underlining, and bold will bring someone's eye to the point that you're trying to make. All of our applications have to be submitted electronically. If you've never used grants.gov, it can take up to 2 weeks to get your registration, so make sure that you do that early. So this is a part that has got people hung up at the last moment. You have to make sure that you have a DUNS number for your organization. You have to be registered in sam.gov. And make sure that you have the correct authorized organization representative to submit the proposal because apparently we've had issues where someone tries to submit in sam.gov and they're not the registered person and it will shoot it back to them because you have to be the AOR in submitting the application. So that's why you can't wait until the last minute to do this. Just remember again, number your pages and enumerate the criteria from which you're responding to. Make sure for your attachments that they are organized and that you have titles such as, and just fill them out. We've received applications where the leveraging commitments are not completed or threshold criteria is not attached to the back of the applications. And then this isn't the other factors checklist. So this is extremely important. We often have people leave this out or don't fill this out. This is important because if we are evaluating proposals and it's a numeric ranking, if we have 50 applications stacked and they're all at 192, but I only have enough money to fund 25 of those, we will then go to the other factors and consider those and deciding which of the 50, which 25 we're going to fund. So it's extremely important that you use this other factors checklist and you fill it out completely. And then most importantly, want to mention that the National Brownfields Conference, if you've never attended one, you definitely should. It's going to be held in Los Angeles, December 11th through the 13th. And we are looking for presenters for the conference. The call for ideas is open right now, and it's only going to be open until May 31st. So if you would like to have your community appear at this national conference and have your information shared with people across the nation, you have to get your application in by May 31st. My contact information, if you have any questions, feel free to call me and I'll respond. So I will turn it over to Miriam.
Okay, thank you very much, Noemi. Just as I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, my name is Miriam Tazif-Abbasi. I work for the Department of Toxic Substances Control. I'm a Brownfields coordinator here, and I'm going to be walking you through DTSC's funding programs. For the presentation, I've divided up into sort of two components. I'm going to first talk about the funding tools that we have for assessment and investigation, and then I'm going to talk about the tools that we have for cleanup. So let's go ahead and get started with assessment. The first program I'm going to talk about is our Targeted Site Investigation Program. This is based off of EPA's Targeted Brownfields Assessment Program, if you're familiar with that. It is an annual competitive application process. It is designed to not have any direct funding. When we bring sites into the Targeted Site Investigation Program, our contractor performs the work. This was designed for many reasons, I think, because this is focused on government entities. We understand sort of any time you exchange money, it's a whole other process unto itself. Plus, we also wanted to focus on small communities that may not have had the strong brownfields expertise needed to find a consultant and direct work. So for those reasons, our Targeted Site Investigation Program is designed this way. We hope to make it easier for us to provide a service and help with redevelopment decision-making when it comes to brownfields. What we've learned over time is that this has really been a great stepping stone to apply for some of the grants that Noemi has spoken about just a few minutes ago. We have a lot of grantees who go on to apply for additional assessment grants and for cleanup grants and have been very successful in using this program that way. This year, I believe we have a little over $300,000 available for the Targeted Site Investigation Program. Last year, in that similar amount of money, we were able to bring in 7 different sites. I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail as the presentation progresses. But we had a nice variety of school development on vacant land, upgrading of an existing school. We were able to support some affordable housing projects and also work on some larger revitalization efforts surrounding the LA River. So from an eligibility standpoint, the TSI is open to local governments, municipalities, school districts, tribes, and nonprofit organizations. This is not one that is open to private entities. And from the property eligibility standpoint, we can't address any state or federally owned properties. Of course, anything that is on the national priorities list is not something that we can do work under the TSI program. We can't have any enforcement orders that are ongoing and unresolved. Because this is all about brownfields redevelopment, we want to make sure that there's significant thought towards redevelopment of the property that you are applying for. One of the things that we emphasize a lot in terms of eligibility is that even though we don't require ownership, it's really important that the applicant is able to access the property for the kind of work that would need to be done under the TSI, and therefore some kind of authorization from the owner, if the owner is not the applicant, is going to be required. So from the selection perspective, what we look for is that the project area, the site area, has a clear need for revitalization. We work with a lot of properties that are blighted, fallow, underutilized, have been sitting unused for a long time. So those are the kinds of projects that we like to select. We want to make sure that there's support for the project, both from the community and from local government, that there are resources available to take the project after the environmental work is done, to take it to the next steps, because we want to see our money kind of follow better money and take the project all the way through. So that is something that we really look for when we make the selections. And I think in the end, we want to know that DTSC's involvement and engagement is important, and that all of these aspects together really support us making the commitment to move this project through the TSI. The application is quite straightforward. We ask for, basic applicant and site information. We want to know who the property owner is and have some questions about their engagement. We want to know what it is that you're asking for. And then we have a section that helps get a deeper understanding of the eligibility criteria so we can make sure you meet the requirements. And then we want to understand the narrative about the site. So this goes into what Noemi was talking about, understanding what the story is. What is it about that site that makes it appealing and makes it worth it for us to invest the time and money and resources from here. Tris Chesney, who manages the TSI program, has put together not only an updated application that's available on our website, but also in-depth application instructions that kind of walk you through section by section what it is that we're looking for. But I did want to point out that applicants may submit individual applications for multiple properties. So if you're the city of Cypress, for example, and you have 5 properties that you're interested in, we'd like 5 separate applications for that, because in the end, after we screen the applicants, our final decisions are made on a site-by-site basis. There's some specific requirements here on how we want the applications transmitted to us that are also detailed in the application instructions. The thing that's most important that I want to emphasize on this slide is that all the applications, the completed applications, and all the required attachments we need to have received by June 20th, 2019. We have a little bit of flexibility and our timeline moves a little bit just depending on resources and a lot of other things that are internal factors. So this deadline is a little bit earlier in the year than we've seen before, but I think it allows us to get through the projects faster with this extra time. From a schedule perspective, like I said, the applications are due in late June. By July, Chris will have gone through the applications and will contact each applicant for verification or supplemental information. Every time we go through these applications, we always do have questions that are going to help us make the decision. We don't have a lot of money in the TSI program, and therefore our decision-making tends to be just extremely thorough. We want to make sure that we match up our funding to the best possible sites. And that's why those conversations, in addition to the application, end up being really important for us. By August, we probably have our decisions and send out decision letters. And then in September, we start our site-specific activities. There's a little bit of, I think, radio silence from us because we've got an internal process that we have to go through before we actually start physical work at the site. But the DTSC project manager who's assigned will keep in touch with you and let you know what all's going on. And generally, we complete our projects by spring of the following year. And that is something to keep in mind when you apply for a TSI. If you're looking for a completed document sooner than the April-May timeframe, it's certainly a conversation that we would love to have with you. If we're able to accommodate you, we will, but we can't go much faster than this timeline that is included on this slide here. I wanted to give a few examples of the kinds of projects that came into us last year that we're really excited about. The first one that I'm going to be talking about is supporting Habitat for Humanity for affordable home construction. What we did here is that we actually developed a removal action work plan. From our perspective, the spectrum of what we include in our assessment goes all the way up through the development of a cleanup plan. The implementation of a cleanup plan kind of falls into the next, the next pot of funding that I'll speak about. So with Habitat for Humanity, they were a repeat customer. We worked with them in the previous cycle to do assessment work, and then they reapplied for us to help them develop a removal action work plan to address arsenic contamination that emanated from former railroad use. What's exciting is that this parcel is going to be used for the construction of 42 affordable homes for low-income families. They've got great local agency support, and they've been able to piece together a lot of funding. So we're very excited that this project will be moving forward. And this is sort of where we are now up top. You can see it's just a piece of empty, vacant land that's not being used for any purpose, and the artist rendering that Habitat provided for us to show us what their vision is for this property. So it is something we're quite excited about. We also had a school modernization project in Gilroy where the TSI was used to develop a preliminary endangerment assessment to evaluate impacts both from former agricultural uses and also from sort of old construction materials that could possibly have contained lead-based paint and PCBs. And so the idea is to use the TSI as a building block towards the update and modernization of the South Valley Middle School. There's extremely strong community support. There's local bonds allocated for the construction, and that money can also be used for additional investigation or cleanup if needed. And that's why we're very happy to provide services to this particular school. Just some pictures of what the school looks like right now, sort of a classic older school that we've seen, and we are excited that we can support their modernization project. We also had a couple of schools that came to us for construction of brand new schools. It's kind of a typical formula that we use for school sites where we did a PEA to evaluate impact from former agricultural use. And it's a building block that the school needs to then apply for state funding for the new construction. The last project we did is also something that was a little bit new to us. Over here, we just did background research, phase 1 type work for 9 undeveloped parcels that are part of the LA River to help them identify environmental conditions to create a prioritization for parcels for further assessment. So this is a part of a much larger project that's going on in the city of LA right now to support long-term LA River revitalization. And so I like this project because in terms of scale, we're doing PEAs, we're doing development of cleanup plans, and we're also doing sort of really early phase type work to help with these kinds of projects. And if you look at the next slide, our project sort of contributes to this future vision of what some of these fallow and underutilized parcels look like. So it's all about building blocks, and it's nice that we're able to use our TSI to support these fantastic projects that could be such a catalyst for community change. This is a new program. This is a program, the Investigating Site Cleanup Program was something that DTSC had on the books over a decade ago. And because of the way the regulations were written, it had been on hiatus and on ice for the past 10 years. So we're really excited that things have worked out and this program is now viable. What's great about it, I think, is that it's not only open to the local agencies and private and nonprofits, it's also open to private entities. The private entities can even be owners, operators who may be considered responsible parties. And through this program, we're providing low-interest loans of up to $100,000 for the development of preliminary endangerment assessments. From an eligibility standpoint, the entry point application requires a phase 1 environmental assessment. Ownership is not required, but there is the need to have owners' consent because it is a loan. So the property is generally used as a security interest. Regulatory oversight is required. This is a program where funding is transferred completely to the applicant. So they're essentially using the funds to make the decisions of hiring their contractor and getting the work done. And another thing, I think it's really important and responds to market needs is that if the PEA determines that the redevelopment is no longer viable, there can be a discussion to have a portion of the loan waived. So for the ISCP, it's going to be a rolling deadline. We are accepting applications right now. And so I would encourage you to apply. It's a new program, and I think we will learn a lot when those first few applications come in. So we're very excited to get started. And now we'll go ahead and jump into cleanup funding. The first program I'm going to talk about is our revolving loan fund. So this is one of the things that Noemi had spoken about. And I know we had a question about providing an example of how it's used. So this really is a true example of how that money is used. So we're funded by US EPA because we had applied for a revolving loan fund several years ago and we were successful. And basically the way we run our program is that obviously it's based on EPA's regulations and requirements, but we allow public or private entities with access to the property to apply for loans, and then governments, nonprofits, tribes can apply for grants. The key here, though, is that EPA likes us to keep a larger proportion of loans to grants kind of kept as a balance. And so right now we really are focusing on getting loans out. Like with a lot of the conversations that Naomi shared with us earlier, we can't give any funding to parties who are responsible for contamination. And some of the standard things, no orders, no enforcement action, can't be an NPL site, apply from a site perspective. And we do need an agency-approved cleanup plan also as part of the intake for this particular process. From the money standpoint, the applicant must demonstrate creditworthiness and provide collateral. The loan funds are limited to cleanup costs. We make that statement because we've seen with a lot of our revolving loan fund projects that they combine construction with cleanup. Many times it's just a dig and haul or some other process that melds well within the construction process. So we just have to be careful that the loan monies are only used for cleanup and not something that's construction related. We prefer repayment terms of 6 months to 3 years. For large loans, I believe we have gone up to 5 years for $1 million plus loans, but generally we're trying to keep the money, get the money back quickly so that we can turn it around faster. Below market interest rates, so we have, I think, about a 3% interest rate for this particular loan. And one of the things I'm going to talk about later, but it applies actually both to the RLF and to the IACP that I just discussed, is that our first line of conversation with you when you send an application is to make sure that you're eligible as an applicant and to make sure that your site is eligible from the site perspective. After that, we have a outside party that we use who takes care of all the financial aspects related to the disbursement of a loan. So there is a loan fee and an application fee for the loan part of the application. You only get to that point once you have already worked with us and we've decided that the project is moving forward. So the RLF is what I feel terribly underutilized right now. We've got $1 million plus available to be utilized, and we really are trying to get projects in. So apply now. We're accepting applications continuously, and we really would like to get some of this money moving. This is an example of how we've used our RLF money. The LA Area Neighborhood Land Trust came to us. They wanted to build a park in an area where green space was very, very strongly needed in the vicinity of the Del Amo Superfund site. The local agency here was the lead regulatory agency for the soil cleanup, which works fine for the RLF. The goal was to build one of LA's first community gardens where fruits and vegetables and herbs can be planted and harvested by anyone in the community. And this was all done in conjunction with the Martin Luther King Community Health Center in an effort to bring healthy living and healthy eating to the greater Los Angeles area. So I've got some before and after shots. So this is kind of, another quintessential brownfield, just a piece of land that's fallow. We've got sort of the summer and winter looks here. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that what it looks like today, this viable, wonderful community space that is used by residents, and it's brought a lot of joy to this community. We're really excited about this project. So the Cleanup Loans and Environmental Assistance to Neighborhoods, abbreviated CLEAN program, comes from the same funding source as the IACP that I talked about a little bit earlier. That was the assessment portion of that funding, and this is the cleanup portion of that funding. In the ISCP, we can give up to $100,000 for the development of a PEA, and under clean loans, we can provide up to $2.5 million worth of a loan for actual cleanup. There is a criteria that this focuses on redevelopment in urban areas. There's a specific population threshold requirement for this particular program's definition of an urban area, and I believe it's about 50,000 for the city itself and the collective cities that it's contiguous with. So you're required to come in with your site assessment work, either a formal PEA or documents that we can consider to be PEA equivalents. You need a cleanup plan and you need a cleanup cost estimate as part of the intake. We are looking for shovel-ready projects here, and state oversight is required. Between the ISCP and clean loans, we have about I think around $6 million available. And I do not believe that we have sort of a balance. We can give out multiple cleanup loans or multiple loans for PEAs or assessments. The interest rate for these two particular programs, they are variable. And I believe as of yesterday, it was right around 2%. So it's even lower. The money here is even cheaper than the RLF money. It is something to definitely think about. Also, it's an open and rolling deadline. I've got our contact information up here. I can answer general questions, and Trish Chesney, who manages our TSI program, you can contact her directly for TSI specific questions. And for the money side of things, anything related to creditworthiness and sort of assets and collateral, and any specifics regarding the RLF, the ISCP, or the clean loan, Jennifer Black is the program manager, and you can contact her. I'm going to go ahead and turn it in to Catherine Dominic from the Water Board.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today, and thank you, Miriam, for the introduction. I really appreciate everyone's participation today. I'm here to talk as a representative of the Division of Financial Assistance from the State Water Resources Control Board. As you might imagine from the name, the Division of Financial Assistance provides lots of avenues for financial assistance to people with contamination problems, including public entities, including water purveyors, and many other types of entities. My program, the Site Cleanup Subaccount Program, is a small program within DFA, and it was created for a specific reason. So we have a lot of funding programs within the DFA. For example, a number of ones that are designed specifically for contaminated sites. But all of those programs have sort of a limited range, a limited scope, and they're intended for specific things. For example, the Cleanup and Abatement Account. That's an account of money that we use in DFA. It's the collection of fines and civil liabilities that we collect and then disperse out to our local regional water boards. So the Cleanup and Abatement Account is for the water boards to use to address contaminated sites that have a threat to human health and to groundwater. There are others, of course, that I'm sure many in our audience are familiar with, the UST Cleanup Fund for petroleum underground storage tank cleanup, and its satellite programs, the Orphan Site Cleanup Fund and the Emergency Abandoned and Recalcitrant Fund. These are all, though, specifically designed for underground storage tank petroleum releases. As you can see from the flavor of these two examples, there isn't much out there, or there wasn't much out there for private parties with private sites to get their sites cleaned up. This slide shows you that GAP was written and intended for brownfield cases that were threats to human health and groundwater caused by private entities on their private sites. This is a grant program fundamentally. We give grants directly to those private parties for reasonable and necessary costs associated with site characterization, soil excavation and removal, vapor mitigation, and full remediation of groundwater as well. I'll explain a little bit more about how we do that, but first and foremost, I want you to know that this is not a competitive grant program as were presented by Miriam and Noemi. So we evaluate each grant application on its own merits. We don't compare it to any of the others that are in our queue, but we do have a fairly intense screening process that we use to evaluate which ones we would like to fund. We are working collaboratively with regulators both in DTSC and in the water boards, and to some degree also with our local oversight agencies, to to come up with an agreement up front about what needs to be done at a particular site, how it should be done, and then we negotiate the estimated cost of the cleanup. This is all done up front so that the regulatory agency that regulates the case knows that they're going to get substantial progress toward cleanup. We at the State Water Board, who are not the regulators but are the funders of this project, know what we're paying for, and the grantee and the grantee's consultant know what's in their scope and what they're expected to produce at the end of the grant. We write this all into the grant agreement so that it is binding on the grantee, who may be an individual, it may be a company, it may be an LLC or a trust, but the grant terms and conditions are the same for all those parties. This slide that you're seeing right now is an excerpt from the statute that created the Site Cleanup Subaccount Program. These are the 5 things that we're looking for when we screen applications to help us prioritize cases and prioritize which ones might be the best fit for our program. So we are looking for places that have a significant human health threat or threat to the environment. We are looking for places that have disadvantages and especially small communities. We are looking for a proposal for the work that is solidly grounded in a good cost estimate. And we work back and forth throughout the grant application process with our consultants and our grantees to try to refine those costs as best we can. I have a staff of geologists and engineers who are very good at project scoping and at cost estimating and with the technical aspects of groundwater characterization, groundwater cleanup, soil remediation, and soil vapor mitigation. So if you think you may be eligible for SCAP, it's also important that you understand, or your clients understand, that there must be no other sources of funding available besides this grant program. So if there is money out there to be spent through another grant program or through some other funding source, we ask our grantees to disclose that information so that we can make a determination of their financial need. That process has become very formal and very structured so that we can tell our grantees what they need to send us based on what type of entity they are. For example, a LLC will send us a certain suite of information. Individuals, all we need is 3 years of their income taxes. For businesses, it might be a little bit more elaborate. For cities also, we might ask for an audited balance sheet. So we work with our applicants to tell them what we need from them so that we can demonstrate that they have a need for our funds. And the reason for that is that our grants are not limited to a certain dollar amount. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So here's the 2 major things I would like for the audience here to understand about whether they think a site may be a good fit for SCAP or not. It's 2 basic things. Has the regulatory agency directed the responsible parties to do some corrective action work to get the site closer to closure? If the answer is yes, then yes, we would like to see an application. 2, is the cost of the project greater than the funds that the responsible parties have available to them? If the answer to both of those questions is yes, then we think you have a shot at SCAP funding. So those are the 2 core eligibility requirements, but many other things also enter into it. That's what that other considerations means on the 3rd slide. What kinds of projects are we looking for? What has come to us so far, you'll see here on this slide. We've seen lots of dry cleaners, lots of industrial sites that are transitioning from one use to another. Legacy sites, for the most part, we don't really deal a lot in projects that are specifically linked to development, But each of these sites overall is a distressed project that comes to us because there's about to be, or they are ready to have, a change of use. So we look a lot at chlorinated solvents. We have a few sites with perchlorates, many with mixed metals and chlorinated solvents and other industrial pollutants. So we are not restricted to certain contaminants. We're not restricted to groundwater, and we're not restricted to this type of site. I just want to give you a little bit of where we are right now after almost 4 years of running this program. We have 74 projects under funding. 62 of those are grants all over the state of California. The other 12 are contract-funded sites, as I just described, and they've been kicked off and running now. In fact, we just added another one. We have dispersed, well, we have committed about $66 million worth of awards. Those are not to exceed amounts. We may not spend all of those funds because we only reimburse the grantees for actual funds spent, and many of them are coming in well under budget, either because we had a smaller problem than we initially thought we had, or because the consultants have just been very creative in managing those funds and getting those projects lean and mean. We have received about 260 applications to date, and we review them constantly. So I do the primary intake of those applications, and then I assign them to my staff, and we just keep working on them continuously until we get them to a state where we know whether they will be funded or not. Other things you should know, if I haven't already said these things, we don't have funding deadlines. It's a rolling system, so we're looking at applications continuously. We don't have a dollar limit for any single grant-funded project, but we would encourage our applicants to look at a scope of work that they can justify the costs for, that doesn't take the project out beyond what the regulator's directing, but is justifiable and supported by a more detailed breakdown of costs. There has been some chat that SCAP is mainly intended for dry cleaners, and it was certainly written with the thousands of dry cleaners in California in mind, but it's not exclusively for them, nor is it exclusively for site characterization. As I said, we've had projects that are much more mature than that, that are almost finished with remediation in some cases, and we do lots of targeted soil excavations and vapor mitigation as well. And although our funding comes from a small set aside from the UST Cleanup Fund for petroleum, it is not run the same way, and we don't have the same business processes and procedures as the Cleanup Fund does. So it is much more flexible, and it's not subject to the same, the same apparatus that the Cleanup Fund has. So as I said, each project is considered on its own. We don't have a massive database of all these projects because only 74 of them have been funded, and we work individually with our grantees and with their consultants from the time the project's assigned to the time the grant is finished. Each project manager works directly with that grantee for the life of the project. We are really driven toward collecting the best data we can to get the best decisions we can. So that's why we advocate for high-resolution data collection and state-of-the-art technologies. For example, quantitative passive soil vapor sampling is one of our favorites. And we really want the regulators to get the biggest bang for the buck so that they can make the decisions they need to make about how the site's progressing. This slide shows you, by the way, sort of the distribution of contaminants that we work on in our SCAP projects. This is just what's come through the door and been funded, and you can see that it's wide open to a number of contaminants. About the only thing that we have not seen yet is agricultural chemicals. Moving on to these examples, I just want to talk about a few of these that I'm very excited about, especially these that involved a joint effort with DTSC. This is one down in Los Angeles near the port that was a former marine salvage yard and had oil field waste in it, and it really just needed a few thousand yards of soils removed. And it was a piece of property that's owned by the city of Los Angeles that they were trying to redevelop, but because of some of their restrictions, they were not able to accept a grant. So we partnered with DTSC to give DTSC the grant on behalf of the city to remove that soil and prepare the site for redevelopment. This project is now concluded. High-tone cleaners is another one where this was an orphan site that DTSC had been working on for decades, and we were finally able to help them get some forward movement on this site. This dry cleaner was one of many dry cleaners that was a source of solvent contamination to San Gabriel Valley. This project's ongoing. The remedial action work plan was finally completed early this year, and we're going to move on towards soil vapor extraction to restart the cleanup at this site and hopefully finish it in short order. Next, we have one in San Jose where a number of households are subject to the urgent response levels from US EPA for TCE contamination in indoor air. The first and most urgent matter was to get vapor mitigation systems installed in a number of houses, and you can see these are just 3 examples. They all had to be sort of fitted to purpose at each house, and as soon as we got this part of it done, we accepted a new grant application from the RP to get on with the source area investigation. So that funding has been approved, and we're waiting to get that grant started this summer. This site down in Diamond Bar is a former dry cleaner that was pretty well characterized, but they needed help from us with the cleanup, which is underground injection of chemical oxidants. This is a picture of the chemical oxidant injection system pilot test. As many of you know, full-scale implementation of a remedy like this is quite expensive, and we should have the sampling results from the pilot test fairly soon. The grantee has an amendment to go forward with the rest of the injections, and hopefully that cleanup will be complete within 24 months. And I think this is my last example. I can almost look out my office window and see this site. This is in West Sacramento. It was a former bulk fuel terminal where the owner and RP was recalcitrant. The Flood Control Agency of West Sacramento accepted a grant from us to do the targeted excavations of soil and remove that so that they could finish their levee improvement project. This was one of those projects that was very time critical because in-water work times are very limited. So they were able to get in there and scoop out the dirt and get it done by the end of last summer. So those are just a couple of examples. I'm happy to share more information with you if you want to contact me via email. Also take a look at our website and some of the tutorials and background information you'll find there with more success stories. And if you have someone who wants to apply to SCAP, please encourage them to do so using our submittal tool, and you'll see the link there. And once again, all of my presentation materials will be available within the week. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for your presentation and all that great information you just shared with us. I just want to thank everyone for their time this morning. Bye-bye. Have a good day.